Hi, welcome. I think we're going to get started. I know everyone is happy to be here, as am I. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Jordana Mendelson. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I'm also chair of the advisory committee of the King Juan Carlos Center. So on behalf of all of the staff and the faculty and the students at NYU who are affiliated with this center, we want to welcome you. It is also a pleasure for me to inaugurate, I guess, what we expect to be a really amazing year-long set of activities with our King Juan Carlos Chair, Cristina Pato, who you'll be hearing from shortly. I also want to take an occasion to thank a colleague of mine who unfortunately can't be here in person, but is here in spirit, which is Professor Jim Fernandez, who brought Cristina Pato's nomination to the advisory committee last year. He is now our newly appointed NYU director in Madrid. His wife Marisa Carrasco is here, so she can whoop whoop in his absence. And we are very happy that Jim is in Madrid, but personally I'm sad that he is not here in person to experience all of the events that he has helped usher in with Cristina. He's a great supporter of Cristina's, he's a great colleague, a great friend to the center, and had been for many years the center's director. So I just wanted to kind of invoke his presence in his absence, because I know and little Jim is there. But just to say that really Jim has been a great supporter of Cristina's, and we're grateful that he brought her nomination to the table, and we are grateful that she could spend the year with us. She's also a New Yorker, so apart from her being here from the year, I would also recommend that you look out for her events in the future and her performances and lectures, because she's a vital member of our New York community. I want to tell you a little bit about her, if you're not familiar with her work. She's here, and she'll be joining us in a minute. She's a Galician gaita player, which we in English call a bagpipe, but it's much more than that. She's also a pianist, an educator, a writer, a producer. She is really a master musician. She's also a passionate educator, and in the spring she'll be teaching our undergraduate and graduate students, which we're really excited for. In her professional life, when I say that she's an educator, I should also say that the first time that I met Cristina was several years ago when I asked her to come to my large gen ed culture and context class on Spain, which usually has like 110 students, and she captivated them. So I know that she's also just, at her heart, wants to kind of introduce you and share with you all of her knowledge. She has released and produced 6 solo gaita albums, 2 solo piano recordings, and collaborated on more than 40 albums as a guest artist. She serves as learning advisor for Silk Road, which was founded by Yo-Yo Ma. She's been an artist in residence at a number of universities, including Harvard and the University of California, Santa Barbara, and now NYU, which we're glad that you can add to your CV. She is the founder of the multidisciplinary Galician Connection Festival and writes a weekly column for the Spanish newspaper La Voz de Galicia. She holds a doctorate of musical arts from Rutgers University, degrees in piano, music theory, and chamber music from the Conservatorio de Música del Liceu, and a Master of Fine Arts from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. And if that weren't enough, very intimidating, she is also pursuing a second PhD in cultural studies. So her shadow is wide and long. So I want to welcome her tonight with the biggest applause and warmest welcome, and she will take us through the rest of her lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jordana. I'm going to start playing. And this is a little bit of a warning because I'm loud. And my voice is amplified, but my instrument is not amplified, and is totally illegal to play this instrument in places because it's 110 dBs, which is pretty much like a rock and roll band performing in Switzerland, for example. That's the maximum volume. of all the things that you could be doing on a Thursday night, you chose to come and see a lecture by a bagpiper at NYU, and I am really thankful for that. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. So thank you, Jordana, and thank you, Laura, and all the team in the King Juan Carlos the First of Spain Center for having me and being so crazy, for inviting me to spend a year with all of you. I am going to take you into a little bit of a journey of what it is that a bagpiper can be doing for, let's say, for the music of the society in trying to make people work together, which is pretty much what bagpipers usually used to do, like bringing people together. This journey is going to take us into a little bit of a history, into a little bit of the journey, and into a little bit of what are the activities that I'm going to be putting together during the next semester here, and how all those things are together. And somehow this journey that I'm going to be presenting to all of you is my way of trying to make meaning out of an instrument that pretty much nobody needs, right? The bagpipe, and how to translate my passion for the instrument into my passion for everything else. So this is a warning. I mean, like, you are still free to go now. You will have an hour of blah, 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 and then a little bit of music. My accent is very thick, and I am really proud of it. But if you don't understand anything that I am saying, just let me know and I'll make it thicker for all of you. Okay, are you ready for this?
Yeah, ready.
So who would like to learn about the amazing history of bagpipes? Isn't that for what you signed up for? So if we think about the world, right? And if I ask you, where do you think bagpipes are coming from? What is the first country that comes to your mind?
India.
Scotland? Okay, India, Scotland, what else? Ireland? Africa? Spain, thank you. Yeah. And Colombia, Galicia. Well, pretty much you are all right? Because bagpipes were kind of like peasants' instrument, like shepherd instruments. And wherever there was a shepherd, there was probably a kind of bagpipe. Bagpipe, because it's a folkloric instrument, is one of those instruments that it really didn't make it to the history books that much. So every region in the world that had that kind of bagpipe will have their own theories about the origin of the instrument. Like, for example, if you ask a Galician, where is the origin of bagpipes? We will say Galicia. And if you ask a guy from Bulgaria, they will say Bulgaria, and the same will happen with the French, and with the Germans, and with the Italians, and with the Persians. And the reality is, that's the truth, like all of us had a deep history with the instrument. Bagpipes are probably like the oldest instrument of mankind. They were made with things they had around, and they were developed with the things they had around too. So if we think about where the bagpipes originated, we may have to go back to the Mediterranean cultures. We may have to go back maybe to Persian traditions, and then through the many different civilizations like the Greek and the Roman Empire, they got spread and then mixed into whatever local tradition was happening around. This map is from the year 200 BC, and that's also around the time in which we can say that there were some proofs in literature saying the word bagpipes, which is coming from the Roman Empire. Before that, we also had references to instruments that translators may think they were also the bagpipes because they had the word pipe and the word bag into it, but there are many different theories about the fact that if they were or they were not. But we get to the book of Daniel and in the Bible, and we do have a representation of the bagpipe in there. And also in the history of the Roman Empire, there are also many texts saying how Emperor Nero used to play that instrument during his time. So to give you an idea, wherever they were coming from, like from the Middle East, from the Greek Empire, from Roman, the reality is like pretty much everybody in that region was already having some sort of a version of a bagpipe. So if we zoom into that map and we get into the tiny west corner of Europe, which is my country, Spain, and this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula. By the way, how many of you are how many of you are faculty or staff here at NYU? Right, how many of you are students? Okay, how many of you are musicians? And how many of you are connected to either linguistics or Spanish and the Portuguese department here? Okay, well, it's kind of like a unique room. Thank you, sorry, that's out of curiosity. And this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula around the year 900. And I usually try to show this to first give us a little bit of understanding of how much diversity can happen in a little corner of the world, but also to understand where I come from, which is that corner over there in the northwest, the Kingdom of Galicia. If we fast forward in time, 200 years or 300 years, you can see a little bit of what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula at that time. What you are seeing in there are also the different languages that were spoken in the Iberian Peninsula that to me, like the bagpipe, is what I try to use to enter the conversation when I'm trying to discover a new culture. How many languages do you speak in India, right? And how many different kinds of music you can connect to those languages. So if we keep fast forwarding history, we can see how Al-Andalus, can anybody say anything about Al-Andalus? Do we know anything about what Al-Andalus was? The Moors, yeah. Yeah, so those were like hundreds of years of history in which in Al-Andalus, pretty much all the cultures were living together. And it was probably one of the most diverse and culturally rich periods of the Iberian Peninsula. Sephardic, Christians, and Muslims were living together at that time. The history tells us that somehow that peace was not so stable as is happening today again. And if we keep fast forwarding in history, then we see how the Kingdom of Galicia is no longer a kingdom. It starts being part of another bigger region that is called Castilla, that later in time is going to become the Kingdom of Castilla. That, if you go back in history, that's pretty much what gives us the name of the Castilian language. And then 500 years later, we see how Al-Andalus is just a little corner in the south of Spain. The crown of Castilla, which is the Catholic crown of Castilla, is pretty much the dominating culture of Spain. And somehow, this whole journey of being a kingdom and becoming a part of another kingdom is connected to also the visibility and the invisibility of the history of bagpipes. And it's also connected to the visibility and the invisibility of all the languages of Spain. So far, so good? Are you still sure that you want to be here? So, 1,000 years later, this is the map of Spain today. Spain has 17 autonomous communities, and we have 4 official languages: Galician, Spanish, Basque, and Catalan. And maybe for some of you to try to understand what is going on in Spain right now, I'm thinking about the Catalonia region. I'm focusing on Galicia, but these 2 maps can actually give you an idea of how back in time that kind of conversation is coming from, and how difficult it is to try to solve history problems if those problems are coming back from like 1,000 years ago. So, in Spain, we have 4 official languages, and we have many different kinds of instruments. And if we keep using the history of Spain as a way to try to understand the history of my instrument, well, the instrument is a shepherd's instrument, right? Like most of the traditions in the world that has bagpipe is an instrument that was connected to the rural traditions and to the different ways of understanding the role of music in the community. The Mediterranean cultures were the most strong ones in trying to spread the instrument, but there is also a very strong Celtic theory, and depending on which side of the history you are talking to, one would say that the instrument was coming from that side into the other, and another part of history would say the other way around. What I try to say is pretty much at that point everything was a melting pot, and somehow it's quite difficult to try to figure out what was the origin of the instrument. In the case of the Galician bagpipes, we we had a very strong time in history, which was during the medieval ages. And we can say that the first representation of the Galician bagpipe goes back into the 13th century, which are the Cantigas de Santa Maria. The Cantigas de Santa Maria was a book that was commissioned by the King Alfonso X, the Wise, and it was a book of songs in the honor of the Virgin Mary, and each one of those pages in that book had a little miniature representing some instruments. And that's what we Galicians say is the first representation of Galician bagpipes, although iconography is the only way we can use to trace the history of the instrument, and before that we can find some architecture that depicts bagpipes in some churches in Galicia. This is for us like the real beginning of the history of Galician bagpipes. And the unique thing about bagpipes too is because they belong to a very specific part of the society, the history of the instrument is as similar to the history of that part of the society in the way that is probably as invisible as the history of that part of the society. This is the book Syntagma Musicum by Praetorius from the 17th century. This is one of the first books that will like have a collection of depictions of musical instruments. And in this book, you have a representation of at least 7 bagpipes in there. And I'm gonna show you some examples of those bagpipes. And these are all literature from Europe during the 16th and the 17th centuries, bagpipers from Germany and from the Netherlands, in drawings by Durer and Bruegel. And if I were to ask you, like these 2 different paintings are coming from 2 different centuries, like maybe 80 years apart, one from the other. And if I were to ask you, what do you see? What are the differences between the 2 of those? Different social class. Yes. What else?
Nationalities.
Say it again.
Nationalities. One is Scottish and the other Flemish.
Maybe. Yeah. What else?
The instrument is different.
How do you see it different?
I don't see the pipes on top. What is the first one?
Great. Yeah. And we don't see the blowpipe either, right? Like we don't see this guy blowing anything. Yeah. Where else?
Nighttime versus daytime.
Huh. Yeah. Or maybe like inside versus outside. Yeah. What about the surroundings?
Public versus private.
Yeah. So what you see on your left is the musette de cour, which is the French Baroque bagpipe, which is the instrument that was made because the King Louis XIV was in love with bagpipes and he wanted to create a refined version of the instrument that could be part of the court. And if you look into the history of bagpipes in any kind of history of the Western classical music world, that's pretty much the instrument that shows up in there. Because Louis XIV made it happen, and also because he commissioned composers like Lully and Rameau to write pieces for that instrument, and it became part of what we call kind of like classical, early classical music. If we go back to this book, the Syntagma Praetorium, pretty much the bagpipe that is very well described in there is the musette de cour. And somehow that sets a standard, and also that gives us a way of understand what are the differences between folkloric instruments or instruments that belong to the community, like the one you are seeing on your right, and the instruments that belong to a different social class or a different socioeconomical status. And somehow navigating between classical music and folkloric music in the 21st century is not so different than navigating between those two, like 3 centuries ago. So, long story short, the Galician bagpipe. The bagpipe that I am carrying, because yes, there are bagpipes all around the world. There are over 100 different kinds of bagpipes, and we bagpipers have like a parallel reality in which we all meet in bagpipe festivals, and we are kind of excited about bagpipes, and we exchange knowledge about the new developments on each other's land's bagpipe. In the case of the Galician one, the way to Santiago de Compostela, in the moment Santiago de Compostela became the capital of one of the most important Catholic pilgrimage, that to me is one of the key elements of the sound of the Galician bagpipe, because we can't forget that during centuries, Santiago de Compostela was the capital of Catholic world, and that means not only religious people was coming, but also everything around that, like every kind of commerce and exchange was going on in Galicia at that time, and somehow that brought a lot of diversity into my community too. We can trace the history of the Galician bagpipe through iconography. That's pretty much it, because there is not that much written up until like the 19th century. And if we think about what were like the best moments for Galician bagpipers, that was around the 14th and the 15th century, in which we can find documents of bagpipers being hired for this and for that, or being like hired for life to be performing in rituals and in secular, but also in religious celebrations. And then we enter what in Galician culture we call the séculos oscuros, the dark centuries, and that's the part in which we become part of something else, and we have to accept and adapt into that something else that is the crown of Castilla, and accepting Spanish and accepting the different ways of understanding culture. And then we go back to the 19th century, and we follow what's happening in the rest of Europe with the Romanticism and the rebirth of nationalism, and somehow that's, for us, the renewal of Galician culture, that what we call the Ressurgimento in the end of the 19th century. And if you follow a little bit of Galician literature, that's the time of Rosalía de Castro and Murguía and all the greatest poets of Galician literature. But that's also the time in which ethnomusicologists or musicians were going back to the little villages and start like putting in paper the music of the bagpipers and of the traditional musicians that they were hearing around. So although our traditional music may go back in time for centuries, in paper it only goes back in time for a century or so. And then we got into the 20th century, and things were going really great for the bagpipe. Bagpipers became like kind of like the strong elements for Galician migration into the rest of the Americas, and then we have a civil war in Spain in 1936, and the whole thing changes all over again. And somehow that celebration and that proudness of speaking Galician and playing bagpipes in public places was no longer an option. And we made a step forward, and we had to make 2 steps backwards. And it was not until like the late 20th century, like the 1980s, after Franco dies and after we do the transition to democracy in Spain, that all these incredibly powerful historical communities like Catalonia and Galicia and the Basque Country, but also the rest of the communities in Spain, are celebrating the difference that was suppressed during a number of years. So how is that going? Are you sleeping already or not yet? Okay. Great. So if anybody wants to learn a little bit more about the instrument, after I finish this whole thing, I'm going to stay here for a little bit longer. So if there is like a bagpipe nerd or a bagpipe freak in the audience, I'm happy to spend a few minutes with them right after, so I don't have to like bore the rest of the audience with like super specific information about the instrument. But there is something fascinating about English language to me, which is the fact that in every other language, bagpipes have a different name. And in Galicia it's called the gaita, in Bulgaria it's called gaida, in Germany it's called dudelsack, and in France there are many different kinds of bagpipes. One of those is the musette. But the English word is pretty much the most practical, because what makes a bagpipe is a pipe Yeah, a bag and a set of pipes. But anyway, if you are curious about the pipes or the bag or the materials, just wait for me at the end of the lecture and I'll be happy to bore you with that. And I'm gonna just put you in context of what are these instruments in the Galician culture, how are they used, and what is the usual setting in the 21st century Galician reality of bagpipers, and then I'll keep talking a little bit more. That's Noitarega, a Galician traditional band that is still like working today. And if you think, I mean, like, why don't you describe a little bit of what you saw in there?
The dance is una jota.
Una jota? Mm-hmm. The dance, yeah, it's closer to the jota. It's the muñeira, it's the traditional Galician muñeira. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Joyous.
It's joyous, right? Like it's like for the people, with the people, celebration. Yeah. So bagpipes were pretty much that in my community. They were shepherd instruments, but in my generation, they were community instruments pretty much. I was born in 1980, and it was around that time in which like being Galician was something we should be very proud and celebrate it in every possible way. One way will be speaking Galician language, and the other way will be playing Galician instruments. Somehow Galician language and the Galician bagpipe became some sort of the cultural identity of what it means to be Galician. I come from a city of 100,000 people, Ourense, in my generation, 10,000 of them, 10,000, were involved in the bagpiper school. Like, you had two choices. You could play soccer or you could play bagpipes. And I chose bagpipes. And my reality was like, I'm the youngest of 4 sisters, and I grew up like playing in every little village in every weekend to like either take people to the church or just remind people that there is a celebration. I will be one of those bagpipers. I won't be dancing, I will be the bagpiper. And they will be dancing around and people will gather and we will play what we call alboradas, which will be like at the very early hours in the morning, literally to wake people up and remind them they have to go to this celebration. And so for me, that was pretty much the most normal thing to do, because if 10% of the population of your community plays bagpipes, you actually think that's relevant and that you can actually make a life out of that. So, but then you leave Galicia, and then what happens, right? And who needs a bagpiper outside of Galicia? And in fact, like even if you are a bagpiper inside of Galicia, because everybody plays the instrument, it's like, you know, the guitar player friend that you have and comes to every party. That happens in Galicia with bagpipes. So being a professional bagpiper, that's a kind of career that didn't exist for centuries, right? Like you could not even make a career as a bagpiper because there was not such a thing as a bagpipe school until my generation. In fact, even in my generation, that bagpipe school would not give you a degree, an official degree in music. It will give you like a special diploma of bagpipes, but it will not have any kind of official equivalent. And I'm gonna just show you what happened to me 20 years ago, which is the fact that I was playing bagpipes with my sisters, and I was also playing bagpipes the same way I was playing piano, right? Like as a pianist, I was trained as a classical musician, but I would sit on my instrument and I would pick up like a John Lennon tune or any kind of like movie soundtrack, and I would be able to do any kind of musical reality with my piano. But somehow with the bagpipe, in my generation, I had to be limited with the Galician traditional things. And I started to like do all the kinds of music I really loved doing or listening to with my instrument. And I was playing in a band that was called Mutenroy, and at some point somebody saw me and they offered me a record deal and to do like a bagpipe album, and I was like, yeah, good luck with that, like literally. And I put together like my sisters and my back then boyfriend and my husband and his brothers and my cousins, like it was like a family recording. And we did this album with pretty much no money, and all of a sudden the company decided to use this line, the first female gaita player recording an album. And somehow that became a big thing. And I didn't even think about it because I come from a family of women and the youngest of 4 sisters, and they played bagpipes before me. So the gender question was not even like a question in my family. My father was the minority. And I didn't even think about that, right? And all of a sudden I become something that I wasn't expecting. And also I am doing it in a way that is also not expected from a bagpiper. I was like doing pop and rock and heavy metal and a little bit of punk, and my life really changed. I was 18 years old. I became very popular, like kind of famous in Spain, and my life really changed dramatically. And I forgot to tell you that the fact that bagpipes will not give you an official education was an important aspect of the way I'm understanding and trying to get you into the journey I'm going to take you. Because my mother and my father, they actually come from that generation that we call in Spain the hunger generation, that generation around the Spanish Civil War. My father and my mother didn't have any kind of access to education. They came from rural, like the middle of nowhere regions in Galicia. And they immigrated to Venezuela very early in their lives. My mother was like 16 or 17 when she moved to Caracas to work in a house. And somehow when they came back to Galicia, she understood, because she was pretty much like the first into this whole thing, she understood that education was the only key for the four of us to be able to thrive in life. And playing bagpipes somehow represented the kind of life she was coming from. And being a classical pianist represented the kind of life she could not even like think about access. So we got trained in classical music. Jordana described my addiction to degrees, but that actually comes from my mother. And at that time, when I released this album, Tolemia, in 1999, I was also finishing my master as a classical pianist. And I remember the moment my mother told me, that's really good, I hope you make money, but you have to keep studying. And I had to like be able to honor both careers. And in the world of rock and roll with bagpipes and the world of classical piano are kind of like the opposite. So I'm just gonna show you a little bit of the kind of product I was for 10 years, because that's the way I like to describe myself 20 years ago. I was some sort of a product of a moment in history, and then I had to learn how to deal with the responsibility of becoming a product. So I lived in between two worlds of my life, two socio-economical realities. The bagpipe school in Ourense was next to the Classical Music Conservatory, and only 5 of us were actually going to both places. And you remember the numbers for the bagpipe school. And somehow that helped me to understand what are the invisible walls between those two realities, the reality of playing with the people and the reality of playing for the people. And I was never able to choose one or the other. The reality for me was that classical music training gave me a lot of freedom. It gave me the ability to be able to explore other musical languages and be able to put my instrument into environments that would have been impossible if I wasn't able to be as quick as I was with reading music or transcribing or composing. In 2002, I decided to move to the US to get my doctorate with this idea of leaving that product behind, a product that really became bigger than I was expecting, and I couldn't deal with that kind of weight in my shoulders. And I came to the US. My mother was really happy about the fact that I was coming to do a doctorate in classical piano and leaving the bagpipe behind. I literally left the bagpipe behind. And it was on my second year at Rutgers University where I met a composer, Osvaldo Golijov, that was working for Yo-Yo Ma at the time, and who was the person that pretty much changed my life in terms of understanding what are the connections between classical music and folkloric music. But in any case, I kept going with my two parallel lives. The life of the collaborative pianist, which is my training, like being an accompanist. The life of the bagpiper, that in today's world I thrive kind of in Galician music, and I also, for the last 7 years, I've been exploring jazz and roots in this country with my US quartet. And I also see the differences between the audiences depending the kind of music I am playing. And it's very unique to understand that you are the same person, but depending on how they are presenting you, if you are a classical musician, you will get a completely different audience than if you are a folkloric musician. Even the spaces are different, and even like the socio-economical realities of the audiences and the place in that space is placed are also very different. And I was the same person. And it took me a while to figure out what is it that we can do as folkloric musicians to at least raise those voices and try to make us question, why is that? And as a pianist, I will be playing with yo-yo, like in Carnegie Hall and Hollywood Bowl, like the White House. And as a bagpiper, it will be a combination between like working with little bag and work who is like hip hop and juking dancer or playing jazz standard. Mostly because I don't belong to the Celtic music scene. That's a language that I've never practiced as a profession. So in trying to stay away from that market, I had to like invent different ways of making my instrument relevant to other musical languages. And my easy question was like, I mean, a clarinet or a saxophone or a piano or an accordion can pretty much navigate between styles. Why does a bagpipe have to be always a bagpipe and play only bagpipe music? So, because nobody in this country, once I moved here and once I decided to stay here and start a career here, nobody thought that hiring a bagpiper was actually important or relevant to the roster. Then I started to design and think about in the way my mother taught me, right? Like being practical and think about what is it that you can do in academia that you can bring the two worlds together. So every recording that I did in the last 10 years since I moved here, I tried to have a story behind the recording. In Migrations, I was exploring rhythms from the Mediterranean cultures into trying to find the connections between all of those. In Latina, I chose one rhythm, the 6/8, to be able to trace the history of human migration through just one rhythm, because, you know, like the fact that all of us that have a very thick Spanish accent are considered Latinos in this country, no difference between any country. And it will be as ridiculous as if you say the 6/8 is the rhythm of the world. And the 6/8 is a rhythm that is the basis for many other different ways of understanding music, like from the Italian tarantella to the Galician muñeira, to the Colombian fandango, to the Venezuelan joropo, or the Peruvian curulao. All of those are rhythms in 6/8. And if we define all of us with just one word, it will be as ridiculous as defining every rhythm with just the 6/8. And I was trying to design something that will help me not only get into the places as a performer, but also get into the places as a teacher and as a person that could be able to bring up conversations that sometimes with other disciplines are quite impossible. Also, it was a very practical business decision, right? Like nobody was going to come to see my show. So if I get into the Performing Arts Center that is hosted by the university, and I start working with the universities into like visiting their classes and into like making them excited about the fact that, hey, this is an instrument that can let you talk about so many other things, then at the end of the week, at least I will have, I don't know, maybe 200 students that will come to see my show. And that in my business means that you are gonna be back into that place maybe in 2 seasons from now. So I somehow am the daughter of that kind of generation of having to invent a path constantly. And that's what I keep doing. Like my next project is called Invisibles, and is somehow the basic idea behind the residency I'm gonna be doing here during the next year. Is also partially inspired by Professor James Fernandez's project, and is also connected to the idea of visibility and invisibility, because in the way that I was trying to describe the bagpipe. Like, a bagpipe is an instrument that is incredibly visible if you come from a bagpipe community. But then if you move somewhere else, it's non-existent. And what is visible for me may be something that is totally invisible or non-existent to you. And to try to engage composers and scholars into that conversation, I was hoping to use music as a way of entering at least that conversation. And then my challenge was to try to think about the bagpipe the same way we think about the piano. Like, as a bagpiper, getting to play with a symphonic orchestra, it was some sort of a joke for like hundreds of years, except for the French musette. And even when I was like a popular person in Spain, and I was raising this idea with some orchestras in Spain, it was usually like, are you kidding me? Like, that's not even an option. And it was in this country in which I began exploring the idea, because there is not that much of that baggage of the history of the instrument. I could like behave like an immigrant in the terms of like, I'm just gonna explore the question all over again and let's see what happens now. And I started this project in which I commissioned composers to write concertos for bagpipe and orchestra. And somehow it's my way of closing the cycle with my mother. Like, yes, I mean, the division between classical music and folkloric music is something that we have in our minds. The possibilities are exactly the same for both instruments. Yes, the bagpipe has limitations, but there are so many beautiful things in those limitations that we don't have to tell the audience that that's not even an option. And when I'm entering the next part of my talk, and I wonder how many of you know Silk Road, actually. Yeah, so can anybody like give like a brief description of what is Silk Road? International? Yeah, so the Silk Road Ensemble, right? Yeah, what else? Do we know anything else about the organization? Yes?
It was actually a trade pact between China and Europe.
Yes.
So a transit.
Yeah. So Yo-Yo Ma, 22 years ago, he decided to use that as a metaphor of connecting traditions and connecting musicians. And this was also connected to the fact of what are the divisions between folkloric traditions and classical music ones. And his idea was to use something that everybody could recognize in his audience, that was a string quartet, and then start like adding these layers of cultural exchange through musicians that will be carrying their traditions in a very special way. So Silk Road is a collective, it's not a company, it's not like a full-time job for each one of us, it's a collective, and that means each one of us have an independent career, we bring that career into the organization, we share the problems and the challenges of our communities, and then we try to take back what we learn from each other back to our community, and then all over again. Some sort of a constant exchange kind of process in music, but also in thought and in the way of operating with each other. In Silk Road today, we have musicians from Japan and Korea and China and Persia and Israel and Palestine and Syria. I am the European one, and India. And there is something very powerful about having to work with each other and having a person like Yo-Yo that creates the space for us to have this conversation, which means is creating the space for time, it's creating the luxury of being able to work together. So Silk Road was the one that took me first into a symphonic orchestra into the US through a piece composed by this composer, Osvaldo Golijov, the one that took me to them. Rose of the Winds is the piece. And it's a piece written for Galician bagpipe, Iranian kemanche, klezmer clarinet, and hyper accordion, which is like a new version of the instrument, plus symphonic orchestra. And once I saw the impact a piece like that could have in the orchestra. I mean, I'm not even talking about the audience, but I'm just talking about musicians that have been playing together for like decades, and just seeing them react to the sound of the Iranian Kemanche, and seeing them play in a different way just because the music was taking them into a different conversation was something very powerful for me, and that made me understand what are the limits that I had put to myself in my mind into not seeing that it was easier than a thought to connect the dots. And at some point, and this is a picture from like 7 or 8 years ago at Carnegie Hall, a composer decided, this is B.J. Ayer's piece, decided to write a piece in which I was playing both bagpipe and piano, and that's like what I consider my circus experiment. But somehow it really represents a part of my life that takes me to the next chapter, which is Yo-Yo Ma. And I'm just gonna put you a little bit of a video of him talking, and that I hope it will take us to the next part.
One of the topics I've been reading about recently is what kind of workforce we need in the 21st century. What will our graduates need in order to succeed? The experts say we need 4 qualities in our students and in our workforce. They need to be collaborative, flexible, imaginative, innovative. Now, according to the 2012 IBM Global CEO study, collaboration is the #1 trait CEOs are seeking in their employees, with 75% of CEOs calling it critical. The Council on Competitiveness says those who learn to innovate will prosper in a global economy. The Center for Public Education trumpets creativity and intellectual flexibility as crucial competencies. Now, we know that our present educational system encourages knowledge acquisition and critical thinking. But what about these other qualities? How do we develop them? Let's take my favorite example of creativity from science. In ecology, the point where 2 ecosystems meet, such as the forest and the savanna, that point is called edge effect. In that transition zone, because of the influence the 2 ecological communities have on each other, you find the greatest diversity of life, as well as the greatest number of new life forms. So that's one way nature is creative.
So somehow Silroth is his own edge effect, right? Like this his own way of understanding those 2 realities. But this metaphor of the edge effect made me understand what were my 2 realities too. The way Yo-Yo describes what he is as a musician is he usually says that what you see on a stage is the tip of an iceberg, and below the water are all the values in which you have to sustain your career. In his case was creating this organization that I've been working with for the last 14 years, I believe. And it's an organization that tours all over the world, and it follows Yo-Yo's lead into understanding the connections between classical and folkloric music, but also is an organization that is housed at Harvard University, and that doesn't work with musicians there. Like what he's been trying for the last decade is to try to bring these conversations into other disciplines and into other departments. Starting with the Harvard Business School. Like 7 years ago, we launched the Cultural Entrepreneurship Project Challenge with the Dean, and we just had a number of questions in mind. And what would it happen if you actually put students from the Harvard Business School to work with students from the humanities, and they have to solve a problem of the society through the arts and creating this idea of cultural entrepreneurship. The same way that 20 years ago nobody knew what social entrepreneurship was, we wanted to tackle that conversation, like what is cultural entrepreneurship? It's very different from cultural industries. Where is the role of the arts in the society? And we ran that challenge for a number of years, and the results were truly amazing. And somehow I, as a person that is part of the collective, I was trying to take some of the ideas that we were exploring as a collective back into my community, and that's how Galician Connection was created. I ran it for a number of years, and this was a project that will put together musicians from different musical languages in Galicia for a week to work with Galician musicians, and directors of centers and festivals from all around the world to work with Galician directors of festivals into trying to create that little ecosystem that Yoyo was talking about, but in Galicia, in one of the oldest community of Europe right now, and one of the industries that are suffering the most right now in Spain. And then I started doing that also for other institutions, not only for myself, and like working in academic settings in Galicia into trying to bring other kind of conversations to the stage. Like, for example, when the Bindel parchment, which is 2 pages of the what we call the first representation of secular music that are housed here in the Morgan Library in New York. They came to Galicia after 700 years, and the University of Vigo decided to celebrate it into this kind of festival that will put together early music musicians with modern musicians and academics. But then what really changed my life in the way of understanding that age effect is the role of learning, the role of teaching and learning in my own career. Because I never chose music as a language. I just happened to have music around me. I was 4 when I started with the bagpipes, and 5 when I started with the piano, and it's like I didn't have a choice. I just had to keep going. And in the process of being a professional musician, I started talking more and more and explaining more and more, and somehow I became some sort of a performer, teacher on a stage, and then I met Yoyo, and then I started working with Silk Road. And then Silk Road started this project with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And this project is based on passion and what is the role of passion in learning. During a number of years, including this year and next year, we run a summer institute there that is called the Arts and Passion-Driven Learning. And we try to explore some of the questions that we, folkloric musicians, when we end up the year without any money, and you question, why are you doing this? Pretty much is passion, right? Because passion is what takes you from having to do something to wanting to do something, and how can we take that back into learning environments? It really doesn't matter what is the discipline. Really, the arts are the key element into making that progression into having to do something to wanting to do something. And somehow that's connected to the idea of listening, because in folkloric music, you learn by listening, right? Like you learn by going to a village, finding the oldest person, sitting in front of that person, and learning the tunes that that person had. And then you replicate that. And somehow in academia or in the way we operate today, sometimes we forget to listen to each other, and we listen for. What do we listen for? What do we listen to? And those are some of the questions we are trying to explore. We tried to stay away from the music department, but but for like a couple of years ago, we put together this class, Performing Musical Difference, trying to connect the dots between all those questions of passion and listening and embracing difference between cultures, with Professor Kay Scholemey from the ethnomusicology department at Harvard. And for Silk Road, I operate as an artist, but lately I am mostly their learning advisor, which means I co-design, co-create most of the residencies that we are doing at Harvard University and at other institutions. And I try to use the same idea of conceptual projects that I did for my own career, like finding a thing that could be attractive enough for different departments and different faculty members to be able to come and join the conversation. I'm going to pass this because Jordana already said a little bit about what I do, but I'm going to take you to the University of California, Santa Barbara, with one of the projects I've been leading there for the last 4 years, Mr. Langholt. And that's connected to the role of passion in learning, and also is connected to this idea of what do you do when you really don't want to be on a stage anymore, and how do you transform yourself into something that you are proud of. And 8 years ago, my mother started to lose her memory. We didn't know what was happening, so for a number of years, we were like running around trying to find what was the answer to that question. We'll get a little bit more into this in October when we do the conversation with Professor Kenneth Kosick, but I wanted to bring this to you because to me it really defines the beginning of this collaboration with NYU too. When my mother got sick and we didn't have a name for what she had, I started writing a lot. I created a blog that was called Where Are You, Mama? ¿Dónde estás, mamá? And through that blog, I was like recording conversations that I was having with my mother, who is the love of my life, and who was like the light. How do you say faro? No, the lighthouse. The lighthouse, right? Yeah, the guidance of my life. And all of a sudden, she was there physically, and she's still here physically, but she was not the same person, and I had to learn how to live with that. So I started the blog, and the blog led me to trying to create like a musical piece that will help me process my mother's disease, but also that will help me understand what was going on. Since we were at Harvard and I had the ability to connect with different departments there, I started talking to Dr. Miguel Alonso, who happens to be from Galicia too, and he is in the neuroscience department there. And we started exploring this idea of memory loss and cultural memory loss through music. And the fact that my mother, for a while at the beginning of the disease, started to like sing songs that we've never heard before, songs that were like traditional Galician because they really sounded like very old songs, but I've known my mother all my life, and I've never heard her singing things like that. And I was like, wow, what are the other things that are hidden in there that now with the disease I can actually go in there? And somehow music helped me to understand a little bit more about what was going on with my mother, and also it gave me the strength to try to create a piece that will define her disease, but also that could be like universal enough to be able to tell a story about the river of forgetfulness, which is what we understand my mother has, which is frontotemporal dementia. Long story short, that piece opened a door to my way of understanding my relationship with other academic institutions. Because at Harvard, I am there because of Silk Road, but at the University of California, Santa Barbara, I'm there because of a number of reasons, but also because a very generous human being decided that maybe having an artist like me in an institution like UCSB was something that could be meaningful for both sides. And this piece, for me, was the key. It was a piece that I brought into Ken Kosick, who is the neuroscientist that is coming in October here, and who happens to be a humanist apart from being a neuroscientist. And we started exploring the idea of what happens if you look at the same problem from completely different perspectives. What happens when you put a person that actually studies memory loss as a career, like he does, with a person that has memory loss as part of the cultural identity of the community, like in my case, but also as part of my personal life right now. And what are the conversations that are in between that cognitive perspective of memory loss and that cultural perspective of memory loss? So Ken and I started with a crazy idea. Like, why don't we create a class? Why don't we put like a bunch of faculty members together, coming from completely different departments, and we put together like a lab of learning in which students from many different backgrounds could come and also try to explore what are the connections between disciplines through this idea of memory loss. And Mr. John Anhold, who is in the room today, and has a very meaningful connection to UCSB, didn't think that that was too crazy of an idea and decided to support it. And Memory, an interdisciplinary exploration, is a class that runs at UCSB every 2 summers, 6 weeks, 9 hours a week. And we explore the idea of cultural memories through migration and human cognition. And there is something very unique about that topic, which is not that much about the disciplines we are bringing into the room. It's mostly about the idea of migration and cultural memory, what gets students into the room. And those stories are the stories that actually lead us to create the projects with them. This last edition that just finished 2 weeks ago, we had James Fernandez again, talking about invisible immigrants, but we also had people from the geography, anthropology, and Asian American studies, and the Department of Theater and Dance, and the Center of Black Studies, all together coming to co-teach and co-create this class with Ken and I. And I'm gonna leave it in there for now. And speaking of Ken, this is the next public lecture that is going to be happening in this room on October 17th. For those of you who doesn't know him, Ken Kosick is one of the neuroscientists that, along with Professor Francisco Lopera in Colombia, they were the ones that discovered the gene that's, how do you say that in English? The early onset of Alzheimer's gene in a community in Antioquia in Colombia. And the way we met, and actually the way I met him, was because that gene, for a while, at the beginning of their investigation, was called the conquistador gene. Because when they started tracing the genetics of this family, and I'm talking about like a family of thousands of people, I mean people that are related by like hundreds of years of history, they could trace that gene back to Spain, to a Spanish conquistador. And that's how we started our collaboration at UCSB, like thinking about how could we talk about that problem through a different perspective. So Ken is gonna come. He's gonna talk a little bit about his work in Antioquia, and then we are gonna engage a little bit more into this conversation of memory and cultural memory, and what do a neuroscientist and a bagpiper do together. And I'm going to leave it there, and I am going to open the floor for questions now, if you are not too bored. And yeah, and I just want to say thank you again, because to me, just the fact of being a bagpiper in this kind of environment is like a little dream that I never dare to dream in my life. So I am really thankful to all of you for being here.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And in your opinion, because music is such an international language, can it be used more efficiently to bring people together in a peaceful way in this world full of turmoil?
Yeah, I mean, somehow Silk Road tries to address that question. The fact that we are a collective means that we try to target the important questions of the moment on a stage. Like who is on a stage on a specific tour is usually informed by the conversations that are going on. Like Kina Nazme, the Syrian musician that is part of the collective, became a very important voice of who we are as an organization ever since the situation in Syria became a war, right? And having Lebanese musicians working with Israeli musicians and with Syrian and Iranians and Americans all together in the same stage is somehow our way of creating that sensation or that feeling of understanding that is possible in music. But we are not the only ones. I mean, there are hundreds of organizations doing that kind of work, like Barenboim's East and West Demon Orchestra. And the problem is, if the conversation is only a musical one, then how do you transcend that? Like, how do you make it relevant to the other parts of the society? because we are talking about institutions that have audiences that are able to pay like $150 for a ticket to get there, right? Like if you go to Carnegie Hall to see Yo-Yo or Barenboim, that's a very exclusive kind of reality. How do you take that conversation to the other communities, right?
The expression that popped in my mind as you moved along is like you've had a life of cross-pollination. Something I believe in dearly. Believed in that for many years. I didn't have a name for it until I saw it in MIT Review magazine, speaking about problem solving, putting different generations, different disciplines around a table and coming up with a solution to a problem. So I wonder if you are, or you have done, or you are thinking of coming into public school settings with your story. Because I think nothing engages a child or a young person more than a real story, someone, what you've been through, that if she's done it, maybe I can do it.
Yeah.
And so I just encourage you, and I hope you do that. And I'll follow up with you because we'd love to have you in Sunset Park. Maybe
Yay.
start that process in a Latino community where our children really need to be, have those experiences of adults who have dared, who thought outside of the box, who took a chance, and here you are.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the fact that I became learning advisor for Silk Road, it was connected to the fact that I used to visit a lot of public schools, not only in this country, but also in my country, and in Angola, and in Cuba, and in China, and in Korea. That was the way I talk to people is very easy for sixth graders, and the conversations are equally as meaningful than the conversations with like academics. One of the projects that I am really, which is the project that took me to the White House, it was an initiative that was started, I think in 2010 by Michelle Obama. It was called Turnaround Arts. And Turnaround Arts was a project that they designed with the idea of what could happen in the 7 lowest performing schools of the US if you insert the arts and try to actually have a tangible result out of that process. So we did that pilot for 3 years. I got assigned a couple of schools. One of them was in a northern Cheyenne reservation in Lame Deer, Montana. And that's a conversation for another talk. But speaking of cultural visibility and invisibility and divisions, invisible walls, that was truly a very meaningful way of learning about this culture through the lens of 6th graders. And but I'm happy to follow up that conversation. That's pretty much what I do well.
I just have a question.
Yes,
About your hair.
about my hair. Yeah.
I see the screen.
Yeah.
You know.
You still see it, right?
Beautiful. Still green,
Yeah.
And it's been green for a long time. So
Yeah.
I just wonder, what that
Yeah, so you heard about my mother, right?
Yes.
So when I was like 17 years old, I told my mother that I was going to the hairdresser because I read a book by Kandinsky, and he had a theory about green, and I was kind of radical, and I thought, maybe I can put my hair green. I told my mother that I was going to go and change the color of my hair. I came back home like this, and she stopped talking to me for a month. Like if you know Galicians, you know what that means. Like literally not even looking at me for a month. That was like the cruelest moment of her relationship to me. But she said one thing like, whatever decision you make in your life, take it responsibly. And then it felt too difficult to go back to the other color after that, and I am stuck with it after like 21 years. But I don't know, it's like bagpipes for me. I feel like they have superpowers, and there is something about being a bagpiper and having green hair that doesn't make people feel threatened by you. And usually makes them smile, and there is not better way of starting a conversation than that. And that's why when I am almost 40, I still have my green hair. Yeah. Yes? And you are still here. What is wrong with all of you? Great. So speaking of immigrants, and speaking of musicians that live in between, I'm going to invite Julian, who is an amazing accordion player who navigates, like me, in between many different musical languages. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit to them?
Well, first of all, as a colleague and a friend of yours, I was just delighted that you took us through this journey. So thank you for that. I felt very relevant in many aspects because, as you mentioned, the gaita, the bagpipe, is a very popular instrument, and it's really in many cultures, and it's been through a generation at the cornerstone of people. And I feel that my instrument, the accordion, kind of carries a little bit or shares some of that, and it's very challenging for us to open people's mind on what our instruments can do on certain stages, such as chamber music, jazz, what have you, and kind of not necessarily take it out of the popular context, but just to display perhaps what other facets those instruments can do. And certainly Cristina has accomplished just that, and it's beautiful to see, so congratulations. And the accordion, what I've tried to do is something very similar, is to educate people on what the possibilities it can offer musically. And I've made it a life's mission to, I used to think as a younger rebel teenager that I would convince everyone, and now it's a bit, I got a nine months old at home, so things are a little bit more like I start understanding what life really means. And so now I'm not so much about trying to convince and be a conquistador, but rather just to honestly share my passion for music and for the instrument that I happen to play since 9 years old, which is the accordion. So.
Julian Labro. Thank you.